Hello, friends. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is our unabridged interview with Professor Kathryn Gin Lum. Kathryn is a professor at Stanford University in religious studies. Fascinating conversation today about her award-winning book, Heathen. Heathen was a word that we would use in Alabama to deride anyone's supposed non-Christian behavior. You know, if they didn't go to church 3 times a week, then they might be heathens. Little did I know at the time that heathen has a long and troubling history as a word of immense power related to colonization and imperialism. And so this is just a fascinating conversation that invites us to pay attention to more things than we often pay attention to. Enjoy. Kathryn Gin Lum. Kathryn Gin Lum is professor in the Religious Studies Department at Stanford in collaboration with the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. She's the author of Damned Nation, Hell in America, From the Revolution to Reconstruction, and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Race in American History. Today we're discussing Professor Gin Lum's most recent and multiple award-winning book, Heathen, Religion and Race in American History. Welcome, good professor.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Joining us from Hong Kong.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for accommodating the time difference.
Yeah, well, we're grateful. We're grateful for you accommodating us as well. So heathen, heathen is a word that I remember being used rather jokingly in being raised in Alabama, where people would throw around the word and sort of, he's a heathen. And yet here, I never imagined that there would be this grand academic treatise upon the word heathen. So maybe let's start
Yes.
with kind of so listeners can have a sense of the weight or the freight that is carried by the word heathen, and maybe a little bit of the background of the history, perhaps, of it, of the use of the word.
Yeah. That's funny. No, I've actually heard the same thing from people in the Southeast about the use of the term heathen.
Yeah.
So the term heathen, or the concept heathen, it's an Anglo-Germanic translation of the Latin pagans, basically. And so pagans originally referred to the rustic people who lived in the countryside, who continued to worship, the old Roman gods instead of converting to the new religion of Christianity. And so heathen, just like pagan refers to countryside, heathen refers to the heath, right? So people who are heathens are supposed to be people in Anglo-Germanic areas who live away from the centers of, civilization and Christianity, who continue to worship the old gods like Thor and Odin. So initially the term was really used to create a kind of intra-group divide between those who accept Christianity and those who don't, in a European context. But then as Europeans, set their sights on the world, as they realize that there is more to the world than they thought, the term then expands to name intergroup difference. And so it expands to take in people and places, cultures from all over the globe. And so it comes to include everyone who doesn't worship the monotheistic Abrahamic God. So not Christians, not Jews, and not Muslims. Although in practice, Muslims slip in and out of the heathen category. Sometimes they're grouped together with them and sometimes not. So heathens were thought to be people whose societies had either, failed to develop or had stagnated. They're thought to be people who were unable or unwilling to take care of their lands and incapable of taking care of their own bodies.
So to summarize then, it's originally a word employed within the European context to kind of distance more urban and or explicit Christians from those who are more rural and not. And then in time, it becomes a label to categorize people out there who basically not European, but it's also they're not European and they're not Christian. Is that a helpful, accurate summary?
Yes,
then?
Very helpful.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a lot to explore under that, but before we do that, let me ask a question about your own sort of personal engagement with this material. And as you and I both know, obviously in the academic world, there's always this kind of presumed dichotomy, and I might even say conceit between the personal and the subjective versus the academic and the objective.
Yeah.
And yet you kind of set out at the beginning a sort of your own sort of subjectivity, your own sort of personal experience about that. Would you describe a little bit about how you felt like that was important, and or how you came about to decide, okay, I'm going to go ahead and set this out there because it's important for me to deal with this topic?
Yeah. That was a hard decision. It felt a little bit scary, honestly, to put myself out there in that way. And I was certainly trained as an academic who's supposed to be objective and not put myself out there and, to just write history as history. And I'm not part of that. But, the more that I've been reading, researching, studying, and inspired by other scholars who have put themselves out there and who've argued that really there is no such thing as objective history, right? Everybody writes from a point of view. Everybody researches from a point of view. Just some people are more explicit about it than others. I think I felt like I had to tell that part of the story because this is a really personal subject for me. I write in the book that I grew up in a conservative Christian denomination. I grew up in a Chinese American family. My parents were immigrants. And I really kind of had this sense growing up as a kid that I was lucky or blessed, right? We didn't say lucky. I was blessed. Blessed to have been saved, to have been born into a Christian family in the United States. And I grew up kind of wondering and worrying about relatives, ancestors, people in China that I didn't know. My dad was adopted, so I don't know who half of my family is. And I grew up worrying about them and thinking, if I had grown up in that context, I would have been a heathen. And that was actually the word that my church still used. They still used the word heathen when I was a kid. And so I had this sense of, again, gratitude for having been saved, but also a sense of kind of guilt and worry and responsibility about what I needed to do to help those other people, right? So since I was saved, what was my duty to those other people? I guess in researching and writing this book, I found that dual sense of gratitude and guilt, as a kid, I felt like it was really unique to me. Like, I'm a Chinese American, child of an adoptee. It felt really unique. And I found that, no, this is a sense that lots of people have had, right? It's a sense that Europeans, Euro-American Christians had when they encountered people that they thought were heathens. They felt themselves to be grateful, again, for the blessings that they enjoyed, and guilt for, looking at people who they thought were suffering in these heathen lands, in a sense that they had the responsibility to save them and to help them. In writing this book, I really kind of struggled with a sense of being both the us and the them, which I write about in the introduction. I felt that was really important to say, of feeling both that, I'm from a people that was on the receiving end of this kind of missionization, right? But on the other hand, raised as a Christian and kind of understanding this impulse, I can also see where they were coming from.
Yeah.
And I also, I write in the book that I've known Christians who were genuinely and sincerely, like, just so kind and so well-meaning. And so I wanted to tell a story that kind of included all of that complexity, all of that nuance, and I think cognitive dissonance, really, of struggling with, the idea that, there are people who really did want to and try to help, and yet hurt a lot in the process, right? So,
you tell a story about a particular experience you had as a child in your church. Would you share that with us?
Yes. So when I was a kid, and this was in the 1990s, I was part of the church choir, and we put on musicals every year. So this was like one of the most exciting parts of the year. Usually we did stories from the Bible. So we did like Noah one year and Jonah. My brother also sang in the choir. So, there was one year when he was Noah and I was Mrs. Noah, which was a little awkward. But but one year, the musical that we put on was about missions. It was called The Mission Connection. And the central characters, there were a couple central characters in that musical. One of them was a new Christian named Hugo, who learns about the Great Commission to evangelize the world and then meets the other central character, who's a missionary named Miss Shinary. It's very catchy. I really wanted to be Miss Shinary. She had great songs. Like I could probably sing it for you now but I'm not. I'm not going to do that. But she sings about, her dad, Dick Shinary, her mom, Stace Shinary.
Oh, me.
All this. Yeah, it's really it's really
high
something.
culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's still in print, I think. I actually got a copy of the musical when I was writing the book to just refresh my memory of it and see if it was as bad as I remembered, and it's worse. So it's all about this missionary who brings Hugo with her as she goes to evangelize the world, and they go on this train called the Jesus Express. They encounter all these people around the world who become like kind of like an interchangeable cast of characters. They don't really have spoken lines, or when they do, the lines are just meant to be jokes, basically. It's just really kind of offensive, racist. It's bad. So I wanted to be missionary. I was not cast as her. I was cast as a Native American, not the term they use in the musical. That was an eye-opening experience being part of that. And I'm very glad that happened before the social media generation. I hope there are no records of me in this show.
Did you have any sense of cognitive dissonance doing that as a child, or was it only in retrospect that you began to raise questions about that experience?
I hope I did. I mean, it's, remembering back, it's hard to remember kind of what I felt in the moment. Like, I was mad that I wasn't cast as the missionary.
Yeah.
I'm sure I was wondering to myself what happened, why was the blonde girl cast, why wasn't I cast? And I mean, I'm sure it provoked questions that even if they may not have been immediate, then, because again, like I was raised in this conservative tradition too, where you didn't really ask questions like that.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So I think I felt uncomfortable. It was awkward, but
and
I did it.
In your family, I mean, did your parents have acute experiences of racist backlash as immigrants, and if so, is that something that was discussed in the family or no? Not really
discussed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, before we kind of dive into the book, what was kind of the personal route for you academically that led you to this book?
I think this book is the culmination of several threads coming together, really. So when I was an undergrad, I was interested in the history of Chinese immigration, I wrote a senior thesis about missions in Gold Rush era California, kind of comparing experiences of missionaries with white and Chinese populations. But also when I was an undergrad, my dad passed away. And so that, for me, raised a lot more questions, got me asking a lot more questions. And so I kind of took a detour to write this book about hell, thinking about death, thinking about the afterlife. But then as I wrote the book about hell, who were the people that Americans thought, like the majority of people who they thought were damned? It was heathens. And so that was a part of the story in the book about hell, but it wasn't the whole story because that was my dissertation. I had to keep it kind of narrow.
Yeah.
And so I think with the book Heathen, these two interests kind of came together. The original interest in Chinese immigration and And then this question of the category of heathen and what that meant. Because Chinese immigrants, the slur that was used against them the most in the 19th century was heathen. So kind of trying to understand where that came from, trying to connect that to the idea that the heathen were damned and, what does this mean?
So let's begin to unpack some of that then. You shared the way the concept of heathenism was used by early English settlers to justify the colonization of America, violence toward indigenous population, and kind of two different perspectives there on that, but and two different kind of ways it gets used. But could you unpack some of that for us?
Yeah. So the two different perspectives there definitely goes, it's definitely at play in English Protestant colonization, but also goes back to Catholic colonialism. So I think to answer that question, I would start with the doctrine of discovery, which is the 1493 papal bull that divides the quote-unquote undiscovered world between Spain and Portugal, and that basically lays out as a crucial reason for colonization the need to, quote, lead the people dwelling in those islands and countries to embrace the Christian religion, right? So the non-Christianness, right, the heathenness of the people living in a land becomes a justification for the takeover of that land. So then in terms of what heathenness looked like and what it meant for European colonizers, so there's a debate among Spanish colonizers about the nature of the indigenous people that they thought were heathens. So one camp, I think most famously represented by Bartolomé de las Casas, thought that they were basically, innocent, ignorant naifs, that, they never had the chance to hear the gospel, but once they did, they could and they would be saved, and it, would be a relatively smooth process. The other camp, I think most famously represented by Juan Gines de Sepúlveda, both of them were Dominicans. So this other camp thought that indigenous people were in the service of the devil, right? That they're dangerous and that they needed to be violently brought to the faith. So even if that included enslavement and even essentially extermination, right? So these are kind of the two different camps, the two different perspectives. This, I think, then you see this also happening, these two perspectives among English Protestants, English Protestant colonizers. So at first, they adopt kind of a similar view as Las Casas. So the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony shows a friendly-looking native person with a bubble coming out of his mouth saying, "Come over and help us." So, this is, again, the kind of trope of the innocent, naive who just needs to be told. But this view then, transforms when it becomes clear that Native people are not just going to cave to colonist demands and that they see through colonists' hypocrisies. And so when they resist, and when that resistance involves violence, then the English respond with even more violence. And then also with violent rhetoric to basically accompany and justify it. So, so then they start bringing in all these tropes of, Native people are in league with the devils. The situation of the colonists is like what the Israelites faced in the Bible, where God told them to exterminate the Canaanites, et cetera, et cetera. So, you see this slide from one perspective to the other when quote unquote heathens don't want what European Christians are offering. Right?
And then how would you describe the evolution of the use of one or both of those categorizations in the unfolding of American history?
That's a big question. I think that we continue to see these debates, these kinds of debates playing out of these two perspectives. At times, I think what we see is one group of quote unquote heathens, or other terms have come in to replace that word now. Where one group is set against another, and violence against one group might be justified to preserve the perceived innocence of the other. So I think that's one way that we see this playing out in American history. And then we also see the same kind of slide from innocence to devils, innocence to demons, warfare against indigenous people does not end in the 17th century, 18th century. Like, this continues, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
these tropes continue. I think we can see this playing out in U.S. foreign policy, right? The same kinds of justifications, like U.S. violence is okay because we are preserving civilization and they're the ones who are not, right?
At one point, you explore the idea that the American notion of the heathen tells us maybe more about America itself than it does about the people that are being labeled heathen, which is certainly a very helpful observation. But so unpack that a bit for us.
Yeah, I mean, basically, right, heathenness, it exists in the mind of the person doing the labeling, right? It's a label that one people foists onto another. There are some people who are labeled heathens who then like claim that term for themselves, which we can talk about later. But in general, heathenness is a term that sets people apart, that creates the kind of opposition to everything that you think that you are not. So the effect of this is to basically externalize onto others the kinds of problems and characteristics that Europeans and then Euro-Americans don't want to see in themselves. So the heathen becomes like the polar opposite of the Christian. But as I write in the book, I think the concept becomes kind of like a funhouse mirror. And here I'm inspired by Toni Morrison's book, The Origin of Others, where Morrison writes, there are no strangers, there are only versions of ourselves, many of which we have not embraced, most of which we wish to protect ourselves from.
Oh, wow.
It's what makes us want to own, govern, and administrate the other, to romance her, if we can, back into our own mirrors. I think this is what the heathen world or the heathen concept is all about, right? It's this like funhouse mirror that reflects back to Americans the selves that they don't want to admit they have, right? I think, the notion of the heathen tells us that we are the saviors and they're the ones who need saving. And it also tells us what Americans think is beyond the pale, even as those very things exist within American culture itself. So, you kind of see both. Yeah.
So in what way is heathen a racist concept? In what way is it a religious concept? Help us see that.
It is both. Yeah. So this is one of the more academic arguments in the book, but let me try to make it clearly. And please stop me or interrupt me if I'm rambling on or need to clarify something further. I think what I'm trying to write against in part is something I call the replacement narrative in the book. And it's a story that's kind of everywhere in the scholarly literature, and it's about the relationship between religious and racial othering.
And before you go further, I guess to clarify, this is not the replacement narrative in the far alt-right.
Right. This is not replacement theory. Yeah. No, I should have thought about that when I coined the phrase. But no, this is not the replacement theory of the far right where, white Americans are afraid that they're getting replaced by immigrants. And, there's also a religious overtone to that too, where white American Christians think, we founded this as a Christian nation and we're getting replaced. I think there are actually ways in which the heathen idea feeds into that and helps to buttress the replacement theory of the far right. But that's not what the replacement narrative is. So the replacement narrative is basically a story that says that racial othering replaces religious othering with like the Enlightenment transition to modernity. So, once upon a time, Europeans saw the world primarily in terms of religious difference. There were Christians and there were heathens. Heathens are changeable. And so, European Christians saw it as their duty to go out and try to change and save those heathens. But because the heathen was changeable, this is not yet a racial idea. Right? That's what the replacement narrative says, because race, according to that narrative, is about inherent, unchangeable bodily difference. And so that rises with the Enlightenment, with, pseudoscientific views of the world, observations of physical difference, et cetera, and, the creation then of racial hierarchies founded on these supposed physical differences. But I think at base, the replacement narrative is a kind of classic secularization story, right? It's a story about the decline of religion in the West, the decline of the importance of religion in the West, as racism based on bodies becomes more and more important. But what I try to show instead is that religious othering still really, really matters, right? It wasn't replaced by race as bodily difference, but it underlies race as a process of colonial governance. So here I'm inspired by other scholars. I'm not the only one who's made this kind of argument, particularly Sylvester Johnson, Barner Hess, who've argued that race is not only or even primarily about skin color. It's about the division of the world into a European us and a non-European them, where the them supposedly needs the oversight and the help of Europeans to survive and to thrive. So what I try to show in the book is how critical the concept of the heathen has been to this process, because it marks heathens as people who need to be helped, people who need to be changed. And so the changeability of the heathen then actually becomes central to how this racial governance is rationalized. Right? So it actually matters a lot that the heathen can be changed, because that excuses and justifies European Christians' interventions into their lands and their lives to try to change them.
Yeah, so presumably it's being done for beneficial purposes.
Right.
And thus all sorts of violence gets justified and imposition gets justified. Yeah. I can imagine someone listening and either defensively responding or maybe aggressively agreeing, but maybe both of them wondering, are you saying that Christianity is inherently racist? What would you say to that?
No, it is not. I would very clearly say no. Christianity is not intrinsically racist. I approach the study of religion and race as a historian, which means that I'm interested in how religious ideas are interpreted, enacted, and practiced by humans. And humans can do terrible things in the name of Christianity, just like they can with any religion, right? But others can and have drawn on Christianity to advocate for justice, right? So I talk about this with my students a lot, because I've gotten responses like that from my students. Some of them really, very, very much agree. And then some of them are really worried that what I am saying is that Christianity is inherently racist and, don't go out and do any of this stuff anymore. But I'm not. And I tell them there is no singular Christianity. There are Christianities, right? And there are Christian traditions that arise specifically against the kind of religio racism that I write about in the book. It's like the Black Church, right, which has long called out the racism and hypocrisies of white Christians and has drawn on Christianity to fight for freedom and for equality. Or another example from the book is a man named Uchimura Kanzo. He was a Japanese convert to Christianity, and he rejected what he called it the Americanianity and Anglicanianity imposed upon us as Christianity. And he founded his own movement called the non-church movement, and became a Christian on his own terms, but with absolutely clear eyes about what he was getting into. Right, he saw that Christianity in the U.S. was in this kind of unholy alliance with the nation state, with racism, but he believed that there was another way, and he acted on that belief. So, Christianity is not intrinsically racist.
So you already pointed to perhaps what might be seen as at least one of the hypocrisies in this, in the heathen narrative, in that presumably the Anglo-Christian comes for beneficent purposes to the heathen, but that then in turn begins to legitimate violence. But then there are other hypocrisies, it seems, in that it means an inability, perhaps, to see various developments of other civilizations with all of their beauty, all of their complexity.
Yeah.
Share with us some how you see that sort of hypocrisy as well.
Yeah. So you asked me a little while ago about kind of the academic trajectory to how I started writing this book, and the like primary source origin story. This will all relate, I promise. But the primary source origin story of the book is that it started with a map that I came across it was like a 19th century missionary map of the world, color coded by religion.
Huh.
And so it was like, blue stood for Protestant Christianity, red was Catholic, yellow was Islam, and then gray was heathen. And gray was the vast majority of the world, right? It was like Asia, Africa, Pacific Islands, parts of the Americas, were all gray for heathen. And so that like sparked in me this question about what is it about this category that can like stretch to cover so much of the world and collapse difference under this heading of heathen? And is there something here that, can explain this kind of abiding American ignorance about the rest of the world, right? And so that's, I think, this kind of monolithicizing tendency of the category of heathen is really important in understanding Americans' hypocritical, I think that's the right word to use, like a inability to appreciate the beauty in other people's cultures, and to think that what Americans have is superior and that everybody must want it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't like the fact that I can say what I'm about to say, but I am who I am, and I come from where I come from. But I think that as I have had opportunity over the last number of decades to travel a lot, to learn a lot by seeing different places, I think that one of the things that's just repeatedly come to me as a white Christian American male is the incredible breadth, depth of civilizations of which I was just simply ignorant, and it I hope it doesn't betray any sort of malicious ignorance on my part, but it's clearly underscores a sort of ignorance that came with my educational experience, right?
Right.
And that I was kind of schooled into an ignorance about so much of the world that kind of maps onto that kind of gray heathenism, I think, that you point to there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you have this fascinating, and it may be just you and me listening to this conversation that find this particular note fascinating. I don't know how many listeners will find this, so we may or may not include this for listeners. But this fascinating distinction between the discipline of history and the discipline of anthropology. Could you kind of briefly talk about that?
It's kind of like a side note in the book, but I wrote an article about that, kind of out of my frustrations maybe with the discipline of history. So I have this kind of sub-theme or sub-argument in the book about history and the ways that the discipline of history as this kind of progressive field that focuses on change over time was, really emerged in contrast to the figure of the heathen as unprogressive, stagnated, not changing in time. So basically this traces back to Christian stereotypes about heathens as people who, again, because they fail to understand the true God, right? They then fail to understand what that God wants human beings to do with the land, with the animals on it, etc. Right? So in the Christian origin story, God creates, the earth, creates the beasts on it, all et cetera, and then humans are given the task to subdue and domesticate that land. And so Protestants, Christians, they see themselves, European Christians see themselves as people who invent technologies, who domesticate the land, who subdue it, who extract things from it. And they're doing this because it's their God-given duty. And in the 19th century, they're creating all these technologies, the railroad, steamboat, all of the stuff. They're seeing these things as providential inventions that God has given them to help them do this, to subdue the land, and then also to spread the gospel. Like they see, transportation technologies as helping them to do that. They say that heathens don't know how to do any of this stuff because they're wasting their time, they're wasting their energies worshiping created things instead of the creator. So they're worshiping the land, they're worshiping nature, they're worshiping animals, they're not extracting stuff from it, and so they're not actually making any changes in the world. They're not driving history forward because they're just like living on the land, subsistence, cyclical kind of, understanding of how nature works, how the world works, not a linear understanding where they're, doing something that changes things. And so then this notion develops where history is about people who make change in the world, who drive the path of humanity forward, and that Christianity is what pushes people forward on this path of forward marching history, and that heathens don't belong to the study of history because they're stagnated. And so it's anthropologists who should study heathens because they just represent different stages of humanity's development. They're like the childhood of humanity or the old age of this sort of idea where they're just stuck because they're not doing anything active.
So as you're talking about the discipline of history, at first I kind of had a resistance and said, well, you do have people like Howard Zinn with the People's History of the United States who's pushing back against the power brokers that are making so-called progress. Yeah. But then, as I was continuing to listen to you, it's like the secularists, historians, and especially I think right now we're seeing the techno-secularists, utopians, the Sam Altmans of the world. They seem to have a very profound notion of progress that could fit into this whole narrative, it seems to me. Do you agree with that or no?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, the idea like techno-salvationism.
Yeah.
Absolutely traces back. And it does become secularized. I don't think, not all historians are telling I think actually most academic historians are telling very negative versions of history, not change over time for the good, but change over time for the worse. But still, it is still a story of things changing, right? Yeah. Things moving. Yeah.
So you talk about a number, and you've already alluded to some of the resistance or counter narratives to the heathen storyline. Share one or two of those with us.
Yeah, these are some of my favorite stories in the book. And I'm actually right now working on so I'm going back to the whole Chinese immigration, Chinese exclusion era. I'm trying to write a trade book, a book that's less academic. And one of the characters that I write about in Heathen is going to be one of the central characters of this new book. And that's a man named Wang Qinfu, who is an immigrant from China in the second half of the 19th century. He comes to China with a missionary's family, so he's missionized in China, comes with a missionary's family, briefly converts to Christianity, and then his experiences of American racism, kind of seeing Christian hypocrisy, quickly leads him to unconvert. So he unconverts, and then he ends up traveling around the country, going on the lecture circuit as a self-proclaimed Confucian missionary. And he writes in 1887 this piece called "Why Am I a Heathen?" in the North American Review. So I mentioned earlier, I think that heathens usually label that's foisted on people, that they're not taking themselves. But he takes this label for himself. He reclaims it and says, heathens are actually better than Christians, right? He points to the confusion of denominations and doctrines in Christianity. He points to the hypocrisy of white racism. He says that, white Americans are uncharitable, they're inhospitable, they don't care for their ancestors, they don't care for their elderly. And then he points to the long history of China, and he says that it's Confucianism that has kept it thriving because of the kind of social relationships that Confucianism upholds. People look out for each other, and they're not just out to make a buck. And this is a critique that a lot of people who are on the receiving end of like missionization, people in the so-called heathen world, it's a critique that a lot of them make against white American Christians, which is that, you claim that we are idolatrous. Like, you are the ones who are idolatrous. You are idolizing money. Money has become your idol. And then another critique that particularly indigenous people make against white American Christians is, one of the stereotypes about the heathen is that, again, the root word is heath. They're supposed to be wandering in the heath, not knowing how to take care of the land. And what I think one of the most powerful critiques that indigenous people make back to white Americans is, you're the ones who've destroyed this land, right? So like Vine Deloria Jr., native lawyer and theologian, in his book, God is Red, first published in 1973, he says, in less than 2 centuries, American whites have virtually destroyed a whole continent, right? So again, we've lived on this land for so many years, and in less than 2 centuries, you've basically destroyed this. So again, this kind of pushback saying, who are you to tell us that we're the ones who don't know how to live on the land? Who are you to tell us that we're the ones who are idolatrous?
Fascinating and deeply troubling. How, we've already begun to kind of allude to it, but let's talk a bit more about the way secularization plays into this, and the notion of the developing world versus the undeveloped world is one, you see that as one fruit of this heathen narrative.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think originally I thought I was going to end the book in the late 19th century, because I thought, after that time, 20th century, the use of the word really dramatically declines after that. Liberalizing Protestants kind of in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, begin associating the word with narrow-minded intolerance. They become embarrassed by it, kind of see it as a holdout of an older, conservative, kind of fundamentalist Christianity. And then some also become interested in other religious traditions as kind of alternatives, like countercultural alternatives to Christianity. So like Buddhism gets adopted by some white Americans as an alternative. But the more I researched, the more I realized that the kind of mental maps of the world, like that 19th century map of the world that colored most of it gray for heathen, even if the word declines, those kinds of mental maps, they don't disappear that quickly, right? And so I realized, I could not end the book in the late 19th century. These ideas are still with us. They're still with us in both the kind of Christian kind of missionary realm. Their other words have come to take the place of heathen, like frontier people or unreached people. But I think you can see a lot of the same kinds of tropes if you check out like the websites of these organizations. They'll show you like a scrolling bar of people from all different parts of the world. And, there's like this interchangeable kind of sense of a different people group a day, and pray for them, and here's what they need. But it's, again, this kind of monolithicizing sense of these are people who all need the help of American Christians. And then outside of the kind of mission sphere, I think the concept of the heathen world has become secularized into the idea of developing nations or the third world, or to use the crass term of the last president, whole countries, right? These are all like monolithicizing terms that lump people together. And if you look up maps of developing world, third world, whole countries, the same kind of thing, right? They're all vast regions of the world kind of colored the same because they're all under this, heading of parts of the world that are understood to be behind the West, behind the U.S., which again traces back to this notion that heathens don't do anything, right? They don't,
Yeah. So help us think through, I would presume that those observations that you just make immediately open us to all sorts of very difficult notions of discernment. So, for example, the critique of one of those counter narratives that you pointed us to, and I forget which one it was, but this notion of the heathen, those driven by the heathen narrative, the Anglo-Christian driven by the heathen narrative, saying to others, you're worshiping these false gods. And what you get back is, well, you're worshiping your money. And then there's also the counter narrative within so many in the American Christian story who don't want to, they're aware of the fact that one of the grave idols in American culture, in Western culture, in Western late modern capitalism is the worship of mammon, is the way it's going to get put a lot of times. And therefore, they try to be aware of the fact that they have access to privilege or have access to wealth that they don't deserve. And then they want to go find some sort of way to share it in the world, right? And they're aware of the fact that there are people, for example, that don't have access to clean drinking water. And a lot of people are dying without access to clean drinking water. Or mosquito nets, because of malaria. So how then would you want to narrate this so that I don't think you're calling people to hands off with serious local and global problems. But how would you then go about narrating how that sort of work ought to be done with this history in mind?
Yeah, it's a very hard question, and I don't have easy answers. I think one of the questions that I would raise, for people who are feeling this, I think it's the combination of gratitude and guilt. What you just named is that we have all this money. What do we do with it? What can we do with it? Is who are you doing it for? Right? Are you really doing it for the people that you think you're trying to help, or are you doing it for yourself because of this feeling of guilt, this feeling of responsibility? So I guess I hope, that what will come out of this kind of history is, serious conversations kind of about the assumptions that underlie humanitarian work and what it means to see people as needing our help. I'm definitely not saying don't do anything, right? And I also want to make a distinction here between emergency humanitarianism, which is like aid to people facing immediate disasters like floods or earthquakes. This is not about that, right? I'm talking about humanitarian interventions that are supposed to improve the quality of life of people, like in a developing country, that sort of thing, right? Quote unquote, developing country. Students in particular, they always ask me this question after I talk about the book or after they've read the book. They say, what should we do about this now, right? Should we still volunteer for the Peace Corps? Should we go on that humanitarian mission to build houses in Mexico or something, right? And I asked them, who are you doing this for, I guess? And is this coming from a place of thinking that, Americans have all of these great things that we need to bring to the world, the rest of the world? Or is it coming from a place of really knowing and understanding something about a specific community and what they themselves say they need? And that, I think that latter requires moving away from the monolithicizing tendency of just assuming that people need the things that we have. And it requires actually knowing a lot about specifics, right? It requires study.
Yeah.
And that takes time, right? That's not just, you can't just go on a 1-week mission trip to build a house. That's not going to do it. But in the book, I write about how hard this question is and how, I'm like, I don't want to throw cold water on people's desire to help. And I don't think I'm in some kind of like morally superior position to do that. Like, I'm just an academic writing about history. Like, I'm not the one going out there and bringing vaccines and clean water and whatnot. And yeah, I'm not morally superior. I hope to have conversations and ask questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think as I think about the way you framed that, your question, who are you doing it for? I know certainly for me in my earlier years, I was deeply driven by guilt and a need to kind of alleviate guilt. And certainly I've spent a lot of time in my own sort of work on myself, as well as work with students, of trying to invite them to a vision of being free. The question is, what does it look like to be free and have an authentic freedom in the world? And out of our authentic freedom, then we get to give and receive in mutuality. And then there's a part of that in which it comes back around full circle, in the sense that there is a way in which some of that sort of work is for me, in the sense that I learn by encountering other people who are very different than me, other civilizations that are very different than my own, other histories that are very different than my own.
Yeah.
I actually learn to be a better human being for me, for myself, by just showing up and by learning, right? So there is this kind of full circle of doing it for me, because it's like, if I want to be a free human being, I need to be learning from other people, But thoughts or questions about that?
Totally. I completely agree. I think that, adopting a kind of posture of humility and listening and learning from other people, and also listening to what they think about Americans is eye-opening, and it does transform us. And that's not a bad thing either, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so I've been in Hong Kong for the last couple months, and it's been very interesting to hear what locals think about Americans, right? They think America's kind of scary. Like, they talk about gun violence, right? American racism and American politics. I think it's, off the deep end, and they're not wrong, right? I think it's eye-opening to flip perspectives and to listen to critiques and counter narratives. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
For sure.
So one of the things that I'm fascinated with, before we started taping, you acknowledged in your book that you were raised in a conservative Christian tradition, and that I asked you if you're still a practicing Christian. You said yes. And so my question, though, is, in what way do you see the kind of work that you are doing given the fact that you're doing this is a very sharp critique of at least one predominant form of Christianity, right, for the last 500-600 years, that has very much shaped American Christianity. You're doing this very sharp critique. You're highlighting the voices of outside critics, showing failures, and yet you're a practicing Christian. How do you see doing this work? Do you see it as intention with your being a Christian, or do you see it being consistent with you being a Christian?
Yeah, it's both. It's both. I think it's complicated. I mean, I write in the book that I write in the book that childhood me could be a primary source for historian me, but like adult me could still be a primary source for myself. Like I live in the contradictions. Like, I kind of live in that cognitive dissonance. And I think that's partly what drew me to this work in the first place. The denomination that I was raised in doesn't ordain women. And I think if I had been raised in a different denomination, maybe I would have gone to divinity school and I would have pursued these kinds of questions in a different way. But I think for me, I do see this work as a way to explore these questions and explore these issues in a way that's both personal and academic, as we talked about earlier. And, I think the responses that I've received to the book so far have been funny. They tell me a lot about the person doing the reading. So some think that the book is like very anti-Christian because of the sharpness of the critique, right? So they think that I must have abandoned the faith. And then others see it as very Christian, maybe too Christian. Like they see it as coming from a place of Christian lament, I guess. And I guess I'm glad people can't tell, because I think I would say that that's an accurate reflection of where I'm at. Right? It's messy. And I have not abandoned the faith, but I also cannot overlook the terrible and painful things that people have done in the name of Christianity, right? Even when they've been really well-meaning about it. But I think, if anything, writing this book has led me to see how many other people are also grappling with similar questions, that other people also struggle with and live in the cognitive dissonance. And then also researching the book, led me to people historically who have lived in and struggled with that cognitive dissonance. And that I find also very inspiring. So it is a tension, and it's a struggle, and it's constant questioning, but I'm just, continuing to do it, continue to do that work, and continuing to kind of see it as part of my personal journey too.
Been talking to Professor Kathryn Gin Lum on her most recent book, Heathen, Religion and Race in American History. Kathryn, thanks so much for your work and your generosity with your time with us. Grateful to get to be with you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your, really, really thoughtful and probing questions. Really appreciate it, and really appreciated the conversation.
It's been a delight to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Harriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.